I woke up to the quiet sound of my front door closing, and in that moment, I knew something was wrong. Not stolen in chaos, not taken by force, but carefully, silently, by the one person I thought would never cross that line. I lay there, pretending to sleep, listening to footsteps that did not belong to strangers. That was the moment everything changed, not because of the money, but because of what it revealed. Some betrayals do not happen in anger. They happen in silence, long before you realize trust is already gone. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 66 years old, and I live alone in a quiet stretch of Scottsdale, Arizona, where the desert seems to swallow sound and time alike. My house sits slightly elevated above the neighboring properties, a modern structure of glass and stone that looks out over miles of dry earth and distant mountains. People often say the view is beautiful. I suppose it is, but beauty, like most things, loses its meaning when you see it every single day in silence. My mornings begin the same way. I wake before sunrise, make a cup of black coffee, and sit by the wide window that frames the desert horizon. There is something calming about the stillness, about the predictability. After that, I review my accounts. Old habits do not fade. I spent more than 3 decades building a business from nothing, and I learned early that attention to detail is what separates survival from failure. I built a chain of high-end furniture stores across Arizona and parts of California. It was not glamorous work in the beginning. I handled inventory, deliveries, customer complaints, and finances all at once. There were years when I barely slept, years when every dollar mattered. Eventually, the business grew into something substantial. 8 years ago, I sold it for more money than I ever imagined I would have. That money, carefully managed, is what sustains my life now. My husband passed away shortly before the sale. His absence did not change my routine as much as one might expect. We had already grown used to living parallel lives, connected more by shared history than daily intimacy. When he was gone, the house became quieter, but not unfamiliar. I adapted the way I always have, by focusing on what I could control. Control has always been my way of caring. That is something my daughter never understood. Vanessa is 38 now. For most of her adult life, she has been searching for something that would give her direction. She tried running an online boutique, then moved on to small-scale investments, and later attempted to start a service business with a friend. None of it lasted. Each time she came close enough to believe success was within reach, and each time something fell apart. I helped her more than once in those early years. Tuition, startup money, small financial cushions when things went wrong. Eventually, I stopped. Not because I did not care, but because I believed she needed to learn limits. To her, that decision meant I had chosen money over her. She married a man named Caleb Turner 5 years ago. Caleb is the kind of man who makes a strong first impression. He speaks confidently, listens carefully, and always seems to know exactly what to say. I have met many men like him over the years in business. They are not necessarily dishonest, but they are always calculating. There is a difference between charm and sincerity. Most people never notice it. I always do. From the beginning, I felt uneasy around him, not because of anything he did outright, but because of what I sensed beneath the surface. He observed everything: the layout of my house, the artwork, the watches, the small details that reveal more than words ever could. He never asked direct questions about my finances, but his curiosity was there, just below the polite conversation. Vanessa, on the other hand, saw him as stability, someone attentive, someone who listened, someone who filled the emotional space I never quite knew how to occupy. Perhaps that is where I failed her. I provided structure, security, and opportunity, but not the kind of warmth she wanted. I have come to understand that those things are not interchangeable, even if I once believed they were. We have not been close in years. Our conversations, when they happen, are polite but distant, as though we are both careful not to step on something fragile and unspoken. I know she thinks I am cold. I know she believes I judge her choices. In truth, I do, but not out of cruelty, out of experience. In my life, I have seen what happens when people confuse access with entitlement. When they believe that what belongs to someone else can somehow become theirs simply because it is within reach. That kind of thinking rarely begins with desperation. It begins with quiet justification, and once it begins, it does not stop on its own. If you're still watching and starting to sense something deeper beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what changed everything. The first sign that something had shifted came on an ordinary morning. I had just stepped out of the shower when the tile beneath my foot felt slicker than usual. My balance slipped for a fraction of a second, just enough to send a sharp jolt of awareness through my body. I caught myself against the counter before I fell. No injury, no bruises, nothing dramatic. But I stood there longer than necessary, my hand pressed flat against the cool surface, listening to the quiet in the house. It was not the near fall that stayed with me. It was the realization that if I had gone down, no one would have known. By the afternoon, I had dismissed it as a minor incident. I made lunch, reviewed my accounts, and returned to my usual routine. But that evening, my phone rang. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. That alone was unusual. She did not call often, and when she did, it was usually brief. Her voice was softer than I remembered. She asked how I was feeling, whether I had eaten, whether I had been resting enough. At first, I answered simply. Then she began asking more specific questions. How often did I go out? Did I still take my morning walks alone? Had I considered hiring someone to help around the house? Over the next few days, the calls became more frequent. The concern remained, but it began to shift. It moved from emotional to practical, from how I felt to how I functioned. She asked about the layout of the house, whether I kept my phone nearby at night, whether I had emergency contacts set up. Then Caleb started joining the calls. At first, he stayed mostly quiet, adding a comment here and there, something polite, something supportive. But gradually, his questions became more direct. He asked about my security system, whether I had cameras installed, whether the alarm was easy to manage. He asked if I ever had trouble remembering passwords or managing online accounts. He asked what kind of credit cards I used and whether I preferred using one account or several. I answered very little. When I did respond, I kept it vague. What struck me was not the content of the questions, but the way they were asked. Casual, almost incidental, as if they were part of a normal conversation. I had seen this before. In business, the most important information is rarely obtained through direct inquiry. It is gathered slowly, piece by piece, through patience and observation. The timing was too precise to ignore. A minor incident, followed immediately by increased attention. Not just attention, but assessment. I did not confront them. Confrontation reveals awareness, and awareness changes behavior. Instead, I began making adjustments of my own. I updated my passwords, enabled alerts on every financial account, and reviewed transaction histories more carefully than before. I contacted my lawyer and asked about restructuring my assets, placing the majority of them into a protected trust. It was not a reaction. It was a precaution. I also installed cameras throughout the house, small, discreet devices placed where they would not be noticed unless someone was actively looking for them. The living room, the hallway, the office. Not because I expected something to happen immediately, but because I wanted clarity if it ever did. The house felt different after that. Not louder, not busier, but sharper. Every movement, every object seemed to exist with more definition. It was no longer just a place I lived in. It was a place I observed. Vanessa suggested visiting more often. She mentioned staying overnight, said it would make her feel better knowing I was not alone. Her tone was gentle, almost rehearsed. I listened without agreeing or refusing. People do not change overnight. They adjust when circumstances change, when opportunity presents itself. And what I saw was not concern. It was preparation. I did not intend to stop it. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. If you're still here and beginning to question the real intentions behind these actions, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's get into the moment where things take a turn. Friday evenings in the desert always carried a certain stillness, the kind that settled in slowly as the heat faded and the sky dimmed into a muted orange. That night was no different. I stood by the window for a moment longer than usual, watching the horizon flatten into shadow, before I heard the car pull into the driveway. They arrived exactly on time. Vanessa stepped in first, carrying a paper bag filled with groceries, her smile wide and immediate. Caleb followed behind her with a bottle of wine, moving with the same quiet confidence I had come to expect from him. Everything about their entrance felt rehearsed, as though they had practiced this version of themselves beforehand. The house, usually silent, filled with motion. Vanessa moved quickly, unpacking items onto the kitchen counter, talking about small things that did not require answers. Caleb took control of the stove, preparing the meal with a level of ease that suggested familiarity, not effort. It was an impressive display, but I could not ignore how deliberate it all felt. I watched more than I spoke. Vanessa's gestures were slightly exaggerated, her laughter half a second too late. Caleb, on the other hand, remained composed, but his attention drifted. He noticed the placement of objects, the arrangement of furniture, the details most people would overlook. I recognized that behavior immediately. It was not curiosity. It was assessment. We sat down to eat as the last light disappeared outside. The conversation began simply enough. Weather, traffic, minor complaints about daily routines. The kind of surface-level exchanges people rely on when they have nothing real to say. Gradually, the tone shifted. Caleb mentioned work first, describing a project that had not gone as planned. His voice remained steady, controlled, as he outlined delays and unexpected costs. Vanessa added details where necessary, reinforcing the narrative, her concern carefully measured. They did not rush. They allowed the story to build naturally, layer by layer. By the time the word debt entered the conversation, it no longer sounded abrupt. It sounded inevitable. They explained that they were facing financial pressure, that things had become more complicated than expected. There was a pause, subtle but intentional, before the number was introduced. $60,000. It was presented as a temporary solution, a way to stabilize everything before it spiraled further. Caleb emphasized that it was not permanent, that they only needed time. Vanessa reached for my hand, her expression soft, almost pleading, though her voice remained controlled. I listened without interrupting. The number itself was not what held my attention. It was the discrepancy. I already knew their situation was not as severe as they described. I had confirmed that weeks earlier through a contact at a financial institution. The difference was not large enough to expose immediately, but it was enough to matter. They were not just asking, they were adjusting the truth. I leaned back slightly, allowing a moment of silence to settle between us. Then I spoke, carefully, as though thinking through the possibilities in real time. I told them I might be able to help, but not immediately in cash. I mentioned that I had recently liquidated an investment and had not yet decided where to place the funds. I gave them the number. $1,500,000. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. Caleb's posture shifted, his focus sharpening in a way he could not fully conceal. Vanessa's grip on my hand tightened for a fraction of a second before she released it. Neither of them spoke right away, but the change in the room was unmistakable. Interest had replaced concern. I continued, explaining that the money was currently sitting in an account, waiting to be reinvested. Accessible, but temporarily idle. I kept my tone neutral, almost indifferent, as though the amount carried no particular significance. That was the moment everything changed. This was no longer a conversation about helping them through a difficult situation. It had become something else entirely, something quieter, more dangerous. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they processed what I had said, in the silence that followed. And in that silence, I understood exactly where this was going. If you're still watching and feeling that tension building, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's move into the point where trust starts to crack. By the time they left that night, the house had already returned to its natural state. The air felt still again, stripped of the artificial warmth they had tried to create. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the empty glasses and the carefully arranged plates, and felt a quiet shift inside me. Whatever uncertainty I had carried before was gone. What remained was clarity. I did not feel anger, not yet. What I felt was distance. Dinner had confirmed everything I needed to know. The exaggeration, the timing, the way Caleb had absorbed every detail I revealed. It was no longer a question of whether they would act. It was a matter of when. So I made my move before they could make theirs. I left my wallet on the living room table, not carelessly, but deliberately. Inside it was the card I had prepared earlier that day, linked to a controlled account with strict limits. It looked identical to the others, indistinguishable unless someone knew exactly what to look for. I made sure it was visible, positioned just enough to be noticed without appearing staged. Before going upstairs, I mentioned that I was unusually tired. I let my movements slow, allowed my voice to soften slightly, and told them I would take a sleeping pill. Vanessa nodded with a concern that felt practiced. Caleb said very little, but I could feel his attention sharpen. When the front door closed behind them, I did not move immediately. I waited, listening to the silence settle back into place. Then I went upstairs, turned off the lights, and lay down on the bed. I did not sleep. The tablet rested beside me, the screen dimmed but active, displaying the camera feeds throughout the house. Time passed slowly. The desert night deepened, the kind of quiet that presses in rather than fades out. Every small sound became distinct, the faint hum of electricity, the occasional shift of air through the vents. Then, just after midnight, headlights passed briefly across the window. They had come back. I watched as the front door opened without force. They had not broken in. They had learned how to enter. Caleb stepped inside first, moving carefully, his posture controlled. Vanessa followed, her movements slower, more hesitant. They paused in the hallway. Vanessa came upstairs alone. Her footsteps were light, deliberate, each step placed to avoid sound. The bedroom door was slightly open. She stood there for a moment, watching me. I kept my breathing steady, my body still. I could feel her presence, close enough that it stirred something I had not expected. A memory, perhaps. A version of her that no longer existed. She leaned in slightly, then stepped back. "He is asleep," she whispered. The words were soft, but they carried through the quiet. They went back downstairs together. On the screen, I watched Caleb move directly to the table. He opened the wallet without hesitation, as if he already knew where to look. The card disappeared into his hand. Vanessa turned toward the staircase, her body angled in a way that made it clear she was watching for movement. Then Caleb did something I had not fully anticipated. He moved toward the study. The camera showed him standing in front of the safe, his hand hovering over the biometric panel. From his pocket, he pulled a cloth, something small and folded. He pressed it lightly against the scanner. A copied fingerprint. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then the panel flickered but did not unlock. He tried again, slower this time, adjusting the angle. It failed. He stepped back, his expression tightening, then quickly abandoned the attempt. The hesitation lasted less than a moment. He returned to the hallway, and within seconds, they were gone. The front door closed quietly behind them. I remained where I was, staring at the screen. There was no shock left, no doubt, only confirmation. My phone vibrated shortly after. A transaction alert, then another. Small purchases went through. Larger attempts were blocked. I reached for the phone and sent a single message to my lawyer. "It has begun." I set the device aside and looked back at the dark ceiling above me. It was no longer suspicion. It was evidence. If you're still here, and you can see where this is heading, comment number 4 below to let me know you're following closely. Now, let's step into the moment that changes everything. The morning after they took the card, I woke before the sun rose, as I always did. Nothing in the house had changed. The walls stood in the same quiet stillness. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the glass, and the coffee tasted exactly as it had the day before. But something inside me had shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality. I dressed more carefully than usual, not out of vanity, but precision. Every movement felt deliberate. I reviewed the footage again, not because I needed confirmation, but because repetition removes doubt. There they were, moving through my house with familiarity, with intention, with no hesitation left. The transaction alerts followed in sequence. Small purchases approved, larger withdrawals denied. An attempted booking that failed. Each notification was another layer of proof. By the time I set the tablet down, I felt nothing resembling uncertainty. They arrived earlier than expected. The sound of the car in the driveway came just after 7:30, too early for a casual visit. I was already seated in the living room, a newspaper open in my hands, though I was not reading it. I heard the door open, heard their footsteps enter with forced lightness. Vanessa spoke first, her tone overly bright, as if trying to fill a space that had already closed. Caleb followed with a measured greeting, controlled but slightly strained beneath the surface. I looked up, offered a calm acknowledgement, and watched them carefully. There was tension in the way they moved. Vanessa's eyes searched my face, trying to read something, anything. Caleb remained composed, but his shoulders held a stiffness that had not been there the night before. They spoke about nothing of consequence. Work, schedules, vague plans. Then, almost too smoothly, they explained they had reconsidered asking for money. They wanted to handle things themselves. It was presented as pride, as independence. I nodded, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. They began to shift toward the door, their relief almost visible, as if they believed the moment had passed without consequence. That was when the cars arrived. The sound was unmistakable. Tires on gravel, engines idling. Vanessa froze mid-step. Caleb turned slightly, his posture tightening in a way that revealed instinct more than thought. Through the window, the black sedan and the police vehicle were already in place. My lawyer stepped out first. I stood, setting the paper aside with slow precision. There was no need to raise my voice, no need to rush. Control does not require force, it requires certainty. I asked them to step back inside. The room felt smaller once we were all in it again. The officers remained near the entrance, their presence quiet but undeniable. My lawyer placed the folder on the table without opening it. I spoke clearly, without emotion. The card had been taken, the transactions had been recorded, the footage existed. Caleb responded immediately, denying, reframing, attempting to reshape the situation into something less defined. Vanessa stood still, her expression unraveling, confusion giving way to realization. The evidence was presented without emphasis. It did not need it. The shift was immediate. Whatever control they believed they had dissolved in seconds. What remained was exposure. The officers stepped forward, their tone formal, procedural. Vanessa's composure broke completely then, her voice rising, her words losing structure. Caleb's restraint followed shortly after, anger surfacing where confidence had been. I watched them both, not as they had been years ago, not as the versions I once knew, but as they were now. Adults who had made a decision and crossed a line that could not be undone. When they were led outside, there was no resistance, only the weight of what had happened settling in. The door closed behind them. The house returned to silence. I stood there for a long moment, aware of the stillness, aware of the absence. There was no sense of victory, only an ending. This was not revenge. It was the final confirmation of something that had been breaking for years. The police station felt colder than it should have, not physically, but in the way everything was arranged to remove comfort. Hard chairs, pale walls, fluorescent lighting that flattened every shadow. It was a place designed for clarity, not for emotion. I sat in one of those chairs, my hands resting still in my lap, waiting. My lawyer stood near the window, reviewing documents with quiet efficiency. He did not speak unless necessary. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. He understood that some moments do not require advice. They require space. When they brought Vanessa and Caleb in, I noticed the difference immediately. Vanessa looked smaller somehow, as if something essential had been stripped away overnight. Her posture had collapsed inward, her eyes unfocused, carrying the weight of realization she could no longer avoid. Caleb, on the other hand, still held himself upright, but the control he had relied on was no longer complete. There was tension in his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty behind his composure. They sat across from me. The distance between us was not large, but it felt absolute. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence pressed in, heavier than anything that had been said the night before. I could feel the past lingering in that space, years of unspoken frustration, missed connections, quiet judgments that had never fully surfaced. I began with facts. I described what had happened without raising my voice, without accusation. The entry into the house, the removal of the card, the transactions that followed, each detail laid out clearly, without interpretation. I did not need to assign meaning. The actions spoke for themselves. Vanessa reacted first. Her composure broke in a way that was less sudden than inevitable. Words came quickly, overlapping, shaped more by emotion than structure. She spoke about absence, about distance, about a childhood defined more by rules than by warmth. I listened without interrupting. There was truth in what she said, even if it did not justify what had followed. Caleb responded differently. He tried to contain the situation within logic, framing their actions as temporary, as something that could have been corrected. His explanation carried the same smoothness I had seen before, but it no longer held weight. Not here, not now. As they spoke, memories surfaced uninvited, moments I had overlooked, choices I had justified at the time. There had been a cost to the life I built, and part of that cost had been my presence in hers. I could acknowledge that without surrendering to it. Responsibility is not transferable. I let the silence return before I spoke again. The money they believed they had accessed was no longer where they thought it was. Months earlier, I had moved the full amount into a protected trust. The account linked to the card contained only a fraction of that value. The number they had seen, the opportunity they had acted on, had never been real. The effect was immediate. Caleb's expression shifted first, the calculation dissolving into something closer to disbelief. Vanessa stared at me, not with anger, but with a kind of disorientation, as if the ground beneath her had shifted again. They felt deceived. I understood that, but deception requires intent. I had not forced them to act. I had only allowed the possibility to exist. What they did with that possibility had been entirely their own. The room fell quiet again. This was the moment that mattered, not the theft, not the arrest, but the decision that followed. I could withdraw the charges, reduce everything to a mistake, contain it within the boundaries of family, or I could allow it to stand as it was, an action with consequences. I looked at Vanessa, really looked at her, not as the child she had been, but as the person she had chosen to become. Then I made my decision. I would proceed. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because without consequence, nothing would change. Not for her, not for me, not for what remained between us. The silence that followed was final. This was the moment I chose truth over blood. If you're still watching after that turning point, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still with me. Now let's move on to chapter 7, where the consequences begin to unfold. The days that followed moved forward with a strange kind of order, the kind that comes from routine rather than intention. I woke at the same hour, made the same coffee, sat in the same chair facing the desert. Nothing in my schedule had changed, yet everything felt altered in a way I could not fully define. The silence in the house had always been there, but now it carried weight. Vanessa and Caleb remained in custody. Bail had been set at a level they could not meet. My lawyer kept me informed with short, factual updates. Charges were filed, proceedings were scheduled. Everything progressed as the system intended, steady and impersonal. News travels quickly in places like Scottsdale. Within 2 days, people knew. Not the full story, not the details, but enough to form opinions. At the grocery store, conversations paused when I entered. At the cafe I visited occasionally, I noticed the subtle shift in tone, the careful politeness that replaces genuine interaction when people do not know what to say. Some offered quiet support, words that framed my decision as necessary, even admirable. Others avoided direct comment, but allowed their disapproval to linger in sentence. I recognized both reactions. Neither affected me as much as I expected. What I had not anticipated was the absence of relief. I had acted with clarity. I had followed the logic I had trusted my entire life. Actions have consequences. Boundaries must be maintained. Yet the outcome did not bring resolution. It left space. The house felt larger than before. Rooms that once held a neutral stillness now seemed to echo. I found myself moving through them more slowly, aware of how little there was to occupy my attention beyond routine. Even the desert view, once a source of quiet balance, appeared distant, as though it belonged to another version of my life. The call from my ex-husband came on the fourth day. His voice had not changed much. There was still a firmness to it, a directness I had once relied on. He did not begin with questions. He began with judgment. He said I had gone too far, that this should have been handled within the family, that what I had done would follow Vanessa for the rest of her life. I listened without interrupting. He spoke about the past, about the years when work had taken priority, about the ways in which distance becomes habit if it is not corrected early. He said that I had always believed providing was enough, that structure could replace presence. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. I did not argue. There are moments when defense becomes unnecessary, not because the accusation is entirely correct, but because it is not entirely wrong. After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving. Memories surfaced quietly, not as sharp regrets, but as fragments, missed events, brief conversations, the gradual space that had formed between my daughter and me without either of us fully acknowledging it. I could see the pattern now more clearly than before, but understanding a cause does not excuse an action. What Vanessa and Caleb had done was still a choice. It had been planned, executed, and justified in their own minds before it ever happened. That reality remained unchanged. Still, something within me had shifted. For the first time since everything began, I felt a crack in the certainty I had relied on. Not enough to reverse my decision, but enough to recognize its cost in a way I had not allowed myself to before. I had been right, but being right did not bring peace. The days after my conversation with my ex-husband did not bring clarity. If anything, they unsettled the structure I had relied on. My routines remained intact, but the certainty beneath them had weakened. I found myself lingering longer over small decisions, questioning thoughts that once felt automatic. When my lawyer arrived, he carried the same calm professionalism as always, but there was a subtle shift in his tone. He knew this was no longer just a legal matter. It had become something more personal, something that could not be resolved by procedure alone. We sat in the living room, the afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. He laid out the options in a clear and measured way. I could continue with full prosecution, which would likely lead to prison time. I could reduce the charges, allowing for probation and restitution, or I could withdraw everything, treating it as a private matter. Each option was logical. None of them felt complete. I understood what prison would mean, not just for Vanessa, but for what remained of any connection between us. It would mark a permanent line, one that could not be crossed again. At the same time, removing all consequences would erase the weight of what had happened. It would turn a deliberate act into something temporary, something excusable. I had spent my entire life believing that actions must carry consequence. Without that, nothing holds. But this was not business. This was my daughter. My lawyer hesitated before sharing the next piece of information. He told me Vanessa was pregnant. The news did not come with emphasis, but it did not need it. It settled into the room with a quiet force that shifted everything. For a moment, I said nothing. A child. A future that had not yet taken shape, now connected to everything that had already been broken. I had not known. She had not told me. That absence carried its own meaning. I tried to imagine what that would become. A life beginning under the shadow of a mistake, shaped by decisions made before it existed. The thought did not bring softness. It brought weight. I thought about the kind of parent I had been, what I had provided, what I had withheld, what I had misunderstood. There were parts of that past I could not change, no matter how clearly I saw them now. But I could still decide what came next. I chose a middle ground. The charges would be reduced. There would be no prison. But there would be accountability, restitution, community service, a formal acknowledgement of what had been done. Not a dismissal, not forgiveness, but a consequence that did not destroy its everything beyond repair. It was not a solution that satisfied emotion. It was a decision that balanced damage. After my lawyer left, the house returned to its familiar silence. I stood by the window, looking out at the desert, aware of how little had changed and how much had shifted beneath the surface. I did not feel relief. I did not feel resolution. What I felt was exhaustion, the kind that comes from choosing between imperfect outcomes. It was not forgiveness. It was the closest thing I could find to fairness. If you're still here and wondering how this all ends, comment number 8 below to stay with me. Now let's move into the final outcome of the story. 3 months passed before anything began to feel settled, though settled was not the same as resolved. Time moved forward as it always does, indifferent to whether or not you are ready for it. The legal process concluded with the outcome I had chosen. Vanessa and Caleb accepted the reduced charges. There was no prison sentence, but there was a record, along with probation, restitution, and community service. It was a consequence that would follow them quietly, shaping what came next without destroying it entirely. I attended the hearing, though I said very little. Vanessa did not look at me. She stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, her voice steady but empty when she spoke. Caleb remained composed, his expression controlled, as if he had already begun to move past the moment. I watched them both, aware that whatever the connection had once existed between us no longer held in the same way. After that day, we did not speak. There were 2 calls from Vanessa. I let both go unanswered. It was not anger that kept me from picking up. It was the absence of anything useful to say. Words, at that point, would have only filled space without changing what had already been decided. They sold their house not long after. I learned through my lawyer that they had moved to Colorado, where Caleb had family willing to offer temporary work. It was a smaller life than the one they had tried to maintain, but perhaps a more honest one. Whether they would recognize that difference, I did not know. My own life changed in quieter ways. I removed the cameras from the house. Their purpose had been fulfilled, and their presence no longer felt necessary. The house itself, however, had begun to feel unfamiliar, not physically, but emotionally. Every room carried a memory I could no longer separate from what had happened. I found myself spending less time in the spaces I once occupied without thought. Even the view of the desert, unchanged and constant, felt distant. The decision to sell the house came without hesitation. It was not a dramatic choice, but a practical one. The house had served its purpose for many years, but it no longer provided what I needed. Too much of the past remained within its walls. Moving was not an escape. It was a form of acknowledgement. I chose Sedona, close enough to remain within a landscape I understood, but different enough to allow distance. Before the process was finalized, I had my lawyer inform Vanessa of the decision. There was no message attached, no explanation beyond the facts. According to him, she accepted the information without reaction. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. Distance no longer required effort. I had also completed the adjustments to my estate. The trust for her child remained intact, protected and inaccessible until adulthood. Vanessa herself was no longer part of the inheritance. It was not punishment, it was a boundary. On my last evening in the house, I stood by the window one final time. The desert looked the same as it always had, vast and unmoved. Life continues, regardless of what is left behind. We were both moving forward, just no longer in the same direction. Sedona is quieter than Scottsdale in a way that feels intentional, as though the landscape itself encourages stillness. The red rock formations catch the light differently, holding warmth even as the air cools. My new house is smaller, simpler, without the long corridors and empty spaces that once echoed with memory. My routine has changed, though not dramatically. I still wake early, still drink my coffee in silence, still watch the horizon. But there is less urgency now, fewer numbers to review, fewer decisions that demand precision. Control no longer defines my days the way it once did. Time has softened the sharp edges of what happened, but it has not erased them. I no longer replay the details as often. The events remain, fixed and clear, but they no longer dominate my thoughts. Distance, both physical and emotional, has done what confrontation could not. I think about Vanessa sometimes, not constantly, not with the intensity I once did, but in quiet moments when the past surfaces without invitation. I no longer see her only as the woman who made that choice. I see the full line of who she has been, shaped by both what I gave and what I withheld. Money was never the cause of what happened. It was only the instrument that revealed it. I have come to understand that I lived much of my life believing that stability could replace presence, that structure could compensate for absence. There is truth in discipline, but there is also limitation. I can accept that now without allowing it to excuse what followed. The trust remains in place for the child she will bring into the world. That is the only connection I have chosen to preserve, not for her, but for what comes after her. In my study, there is one photograph I kept, Vanessa as a child, smiling without hesitation, untouched by the distance that would come later. I do not look at it often, but I have not put it away. Some things cannot return to what they were. But that does not mean they cannot become something else. In the end, life rarely offers clean endings or perfect justice. What it gives instead are moments of truth, quiet, often painful realizations that reveal who we are and what truly matters. Trust, once broken, does not simply return, and love, when left unattended, can slowly turn into distance without anyone noticing. Time moves forward regardless, asking only that we carry our choices with us and learn from them. Sometimes, the hardest lessons are not about others, but about ourselves, what we gave, what we withheld, and what we misunderstood along the way. Growth does not always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with acceptance. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, consider following and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for being here.